This has been a quickly arranged Q&A session in person because on the CapEx paper that we have coming up on the agenda on Thursday. And thank you, officers, for moving things around and enabling this to happen, because I think if we'd done the formal way of putting questions in, getting written answers, we may have generated even more questions. So hopefully this will short-circuit that, ready for Thursday's meeting. So look, we also, thank you also. We also have Morrison Lowe on Zoom as well, who will be able to assist answering any questions. This CapEx or this paper covers off all our main capital projects. So obviously some in infrastructure, some in housing. So the whole gamut of right across the organisation's business. But I just want to ask our Chief Infrastructure Officer, Siobhan Proctor, would you like to say a few words to start with?
So yeah, happy to present this paper. We gave you a sneak preview of this last week. So Morrison Lowe are with us. We have Bruce Walton, who's the Associate Director, and Dan Bonifant, who is the CE of Morrison Lowe. So they did the paper supporting this. Essentially, we've got significant resource constraints internally, professional services and physical contract work. Those have become apparent over the last few months and much worsened by COVID, especially around supply chain interruptions for materials required to complete projects. So the paper proposes that we will undertake several mitigation measures, mostly centred around procurement, planning, and the need for us to take on more risk when we're procuring resource to complete projects, but we're also recommending that we reschedule the LTP as well, to signal that things are going to take longer to deliver than envisaged in the LTP. So we're not proposing to stop any projects. We are just signalling that they will take longer to deliver than anticipated. The projects that have been rescheduled are still in the planning phase, so we're very much committed to carrying on delivering those that are currently in delivery. That summarises this project, but yeah, if you have any questions for the fine folk at Morrison Lowe, they're on Zoom now.
I can't see any questions, any hands up at this stage. Do we have any? Oh, Councillor Pennant.
Thank you, Siobhan, and sorry, I've just been locked out of my computer saying the password's wrong, so I'll just have to remember my questions. You may know I'm very concerned about the looming deadline of 2027 with a number of buildings to be earthquake strengthened. Is it your view that owners will be able to secure the necessary resources? And if not, bearing in mind that there may be some buildings demolished, are we going to alert the government to the fact that then we have a large number of people who will not be complying with the law?
So at this stage, it does look like, specifically around that structural engineering resource, it's particularly difficult to engage structural engineers at the moment. Fair to say that bow wave leading up to 2027 is quite large, and several of those building owners won't be anticipating doing anything in the very near future. So I think that's something that we need to keep a watching brief on, Councillor Pannett, and make sure that we are prepared to go back to government if we do see that this is going to be a significant issue in the coming years.
You also make the point that people, they want to do the work, but actually my work with a lot of owners is that they don't even have the money, so it's not, that's a little bit academic. Is that your understanding from, I know you've just been in the job now for a few weeks.
So there will be a report coming to Infrastructure Committee at the beginning of December, specifically on earthquake-prone buildings, so it's probably, yeah, you will be a better place to answer those questions.
I'll talk to that offline because I didn't understand that it actually had that much information. Just the other point about city housing, if we delay, what is the likely impact on our tenants? If we're not doing the work that they're living in less than ideal.
That might be Angelique.
Sorry, Angelique.
Yeah.
She's here.
Yeah, Angelique's on the line.
Sorry.
So was that all the questions that you had of Siobhan?
Yeah, for now. Yep.
Okay. So before we go on to that, Councillor Pannett, Councillor Foon, you had a question. Was that of Siobhan? Oh, perhaps we could just go straight to that then while Siobhan's there.
Great. Kia ora, and thank you for updating this information for us. I guess mine is around the cycleways rephasing, and I just want to specifically understand why it's the cycleways project that is one of the ones that has had to be put back, and what is it we could do, what specifically for that project can we do to mitigate it? And I know you're saying that we are doing it, but maybe let's just start there, just so that I can hear it. Thank you.
So we are still committed to the transitional cycleway project, so the two Bowen Street and Kent and Cambridge, so they will be delivered this year. With the main cycleway program, the resource constraint is really around professional services. So if you think about the professional services required in terms of transport planning and transport engineering, that's heavily committed to the City Streets program, the Let's Get Wellington Moving City Streets program at the moment. So actually accessing that resource is a constraint. And as I said before, this is a program that is currently in the planning phase. So in terms of the mitigations, that's around making sure that we have a very strong program plan, because then once we have that in place, we can work backwards and actually see where we can condense it if possible. But at this stage, that professional resource is the biggest constraint.
And just to follow up from that, is that because they are not in the country, or they're zapped up with other workloads, or
yeah, so there's a
they don't
combination of that.
exist
So
yet?
no, well, there is a lot of other work going on. So if we just look at the Wellington region, we've got Riverlink, we've got Te Aratapua, we've got Let's Get Wellington Moving. So all of those are strong, heavy transport-based projects with a large cycling element in them as well. So we're competing for that resource, and as the paper shows, WCC's share of that regional resource is quite low. We're only about 9%, so that's the market in which we're competing.
Thank you. And I just wonder whether I could ask Morrison Lowe just to comment from their report, and obviously taking a very broad New Zealand market perspective. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. And just really, could you just comment about the opportunity, or I suppose the progress that New Zealand market has to grow the capability that it needs to meet the capacity requirements, or in terms of growth, and where you see things heading over the next 2 to 5 years?
Yep. Kia ora. Of course. So over the next 2 to 5 years, I think the market is going to really struggle. There's already a latent demand for those professional services that Siobhan mentioned, particularly in terms of cycleways and so on. It's unlikely to catch up, and the bulk of the resources are going to be allocated at the sort of the larger, more glamorous projects. I mean, I know from my experience prior to this, where I was at Jacobs as a regional manager, we struggle to get people in the country. I believe they're still doing that. We had, you've got these large programs of work going on all over the country, and you don't often, or quite often, decisions are made about which projects to pursue. Which projects to pursue, not locally. So it's a challenge to actually allocate resources to local projects. And in 5 years' time, I think that the market is going to struggle.
Okay, thank you. So how, generally speaking, do you think it's New Zealand be able to attract in overseas schools? I mean, how successful have we been in the past, and how successful do you think we could be in the future, barring the type of work? I suppose, is that the crux of it, the type of work that would attract professionals to come in, or is there the other attributes that New Zealand or Wellington might have to?
Yeah, I mean, New Zealand's a highly attractive market for overseas engineers and planners. I've been involved personally in a number of sort of recruit programs from the UK, from Australia, from the States, and so on. And there is certainly never any shortage of applicants. So if the facility is there or the means are there to get them into the country, there's there's usually no problem with actually finding the right level of resource. And it's not just the quantity of the resource either. It's the actual, you need people to come in who are sufficiently experienced to be able to start delivering these programs and not have a period of training and ramping up of experience. I mean, particularly, the question around seismic stuff before, which that requires specific New Zealand qualifications and experience, where so bringing in people from overseas isn't necessarily going to help with that. People do want to come to New Zealand, but how soon that kind of immigration can start up again, I struggle to answer, but I can't see it being particularly soon.
There's also a very real risk that as the borders open up again, the higher wages in Australia and the size of the projects will attract people's attention both internationally and from New Zealand. So there is considerable risks coming forward too.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just take questions from while I've got Morrison Lowe answering questions. I'll just take particular questions for them. Councillor Pannett, I think you had a question.
Thanks. I'm not sure if you have all of the knowledge, maybe Siobhan as well. Obviously, the world needs to do a lot of infrastructure building, particularly before 2030 because of climate implications. And I think we'll need people with different skills, like, how to build green buildings, build good waste management plants and the rest. So it's not necessarily just business as usual. Do you think that the government understands this and has a good enough set of initiatives in place to address that?
I think there's absolutely no doubt it's not business as usual. New Zealand has these enormous programs. Three Waters, 180 billion. The Infrastructure Commission's calculated $65 billion program. There is no way that is business as usual. And I can't really comment on whether the government's programs and initiatives will be enough to address it. But the first thing they did was get the Infrastructure Commission to establish what the pipeline looked like, because previous to that, there was no line of sight over what was coming down. So they've followed the international trend of establishing infrastructure commissions.
Well, Siobhan, can you answer that? And I'm particularly interested in preparing for climate change as well, that there will be different skills needed.
Absolutely agree that there will be different skills needed. Whether the government is doing enough, I can't really answer that either. In terms of what we can control, we have to actually develop our own internal pipeline as well to make sure that we can see those accordingly, because I think it is going to be difficult to deliver with the current resource constraints.
City Works, I oppose disestablishing that. Do we need to set it up again? It was difficult at the time. It was going to be expensive, but actually...
I think we could leave that for another.
Well, I was asking for professional advice. Thank you, Councillor.
But Councillor Pannett, I am actually with you on that one. But anyway, so that's fine. I think we've got Councillor Fitzsimons and then Councillor Rush.
I do want to ask about that, because to me it's the most obvious thing coming out of this paper is that this council needs to look at insourcing and creating our own delivery mechanism, and that might happen over time. But I would like some officer advice on this, and I'm actually just trying to find, I think Councillor Calvert, you and I did an amendment asking officers to bring us some advice about a City Works or a Ministry of Works type function within the City Council. So I am interested in this, and I'm also, my other question really is whether officers intend to keep bringing these types of papers to us, because I think that work just needs to carry on, and I'm worried that by constantly reporting on the barriers, it's a distraction from the work happening. So two real questions there.
Councillor Fitzsimons, I'll answer those two questions, but if there's anything that Siobhan would like to add, she can jump up. So on the City Works idea, there is a paper there's an item on the forward work program for the Infrastructure Committee in December to come back and report to that. I would note, regardless of whether that's a response that's supported by Infrastructure Committee or not, there's that lead time, and that won't, the establishment of City Works department within council won't solve this year's or next year's problem, which is kind of what we're wanting to mitigate and respond to right now. There will be lead time to do that. The second question around the paper, this is absolutely not a distraction to be able to deliver as effectively as possible. We need to understand where the constraints are in the market and how we respond to them. So we were hoping that there was enough focus in the paper around mitigations, that we're trying to be constructive here. This isn't just about barriers, this is around how can we work differently to continue to deliver on the aspirations in the plan. And the focus of officers is absolutely to deliver what's in the plan. What we're showing you are some of the barriers and the constraints that we're facing that are real, but also how we're responding to it, and maybe some other timings that would change, rather than there's absolutely no intent to touch any of the initiatives and not do things. It's just around how and when.
And I think it's fair to say that from an elected member perspective that we did encourage this paper to be presented because we have our quarterly reporting and we're looking at monitoring of how we are progressing against projects, and this is fundamental to that. Plus also as we move into an annual planning cycle, we need to understand where we're at and what are the opportunities and challenges we have going forward. So this was agreed by through the Forward Work programme. Councillor Fitzsimons, did you have any other questions?
I'll just tell you the basis of my question, which is that this is the 5th time we've been asked to relook at an LTP decision. It's only been 5 months, so I guess that was why I asked, is this likely to keep happening? Because I'm not sure it's a good use of our time.
Yeah. It's probably fundamental, though, to making the future decisions. Councillor Rush?
Thanks. A question for the Morrison Low chaps. So, and it builds a bit on Councillor Fitzsimon's question about the relative merits of an in-house team to an outsourcing one. And I just, as I understand it, it's a bit of a cyclical thing that when the market's tight, you tend to reduce risk by bringing services in-house. When it's a lot of capacity in the market, then you actually get value by being able to outsource with that flexibility. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, I'd say that's exactly how it works. And I think, and just sort of speaking off the cuff here a bit, but in this situation, it might be worth looking at the types of work that you could bring in-house that would be sort of relatively low risk for council, but allow you to get that baseline of work and continue with it and do the specialist stuff over the top and procure that as you need to. But yeah, that's how I see that works.
We'd also just reinforce what your officers just said before, that making a decision to insource work is not going to be a quick answer to anything. There's just as much time to invest in organising yourself to be able to deliver from where you are now. So it's as your officer said, it's definitely not going to solve the problem this year, next year, or potentially even the year after. It may be part of the solution.
And there could be a distraction too. All right, thanks.
Okay, Councillor Foon.
This question is more on the procurement and the comms. So just the procurement question is we're in the process of or we've signed off a strategic procurement framework, so probably for you, Sarah. So I did not enjoy, but understand the proposals you were putting forward to mitigate, but I guess that also made me question, will there be does that mean compromise on our procurement framework that we're trying to get better outcomes for all?
No, I don't think the broader outcomes are something that we'd be compromising, because I think there's a genuine desire from the market to also deliver broader outcomes. That's not where I'd say the risk is. The biggest risk you're looking at is how do you then manage price? So traditionally, when you've got a market that is able to be easily competitive, you can use that process to drive and ensure you're getting the right price. When you are changing that approach because of the market dynamics, you need to think of different ways to ensure ratepayers that we're getting value for money. And there's ways to do it, absolutely. But you want to make sure that you are as easy to deal with as an organisation and a client as possible, so you've got suppliers wanting to work with you in a transparent way to manage that price risk.
Yeah.
I don't think the broader outcomes are the issue.
Okay, thank you. And one around comms, and I think, this is something we have often had to talk about at council, but we do a lot of consulting and we're in that process at the moment, talking to our communities about the cycling network plan. And really, we're kind of changing that again. And I think from an external perspective, how will we manage this?
And Liam, you can correct me if I'm wrong. So we're not changing anything that we're actually consulting on. So the network cycle plan is around that strategic plan for delivery. It highlights which streets we're going to be working on, and it has a time frame that's across the LTP period. So we don't actually commit to any specific time frames for that. So essentially, we're not changing anything there.
Okay. I can't remember when we started consulting on Newtown Connection, Sarah. Do you have a rough date on that?
Diane and I went down to a drop-in session down at the supermarket down there.
I remember
it would have been about 4 years ago, probably. I can't be
2017, 18,
yeah,
something like that.
yeah, about then. So it was a while ago.
Thank you.
Sorry, just conferring with my colleague. So that cycleway is the transitional cycleway that we'll be looking to deliver this year. Yeah. Is that the question?
No. I mean, that is great.
It's not the full.
It's not the full. So I'm just cognizant that community has been consulted and expecting now they're going through another round. And I think in the Island Bay Cycleway paper, it was said that full pathway could be through by 2023. Is that still what you're thinking now that we've got this paper?
That would have been referring to the transitional cycleway. Yeah.
So in this paper, I suppose a few things here. One, the Newtown Connection, the transitional cycleway, which is due for delivery this year. The idea with that cycleway is it is a trial with the intention that if the trial is successful, it then moves into permanency. So none of that is actually impacted by what we're setting up here. What we're actually saying is that in order for council officers to focus on the council's highest priority things, like that Newtown transitional cycleway that could then morph into something permanent, they need the time and space to focus on those things. So trying to secure design resources for whatever comes after Newtown and whatever comes after the Bowen Street one is probably not the best use of officers' time given the current market constraints. So we'd rather use officers and staff to focus on the highest priority stuff, delivering that while we develop options of how we approach the market so that we can be sure of success when we do want to design the next cycleway on the list, which hasn't been determined which one is next.
Okay. So in the Island Bay Cycleway paper, it did say 2023. So was that referring to the transitional cycleway, or was that referring to the through from Island Bay to the city?
That was Island Bay to the city, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah, I would like that, please. I'll email you now. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. This question is back to Morrison Lowe. We talked about professional services, but what about actual access to materials? Because we're hearing anecdotally, at least even in residential building, that access to materials is really difficult now, even New Zealand manufactured materials. So any particular comments from you on that in terms of the accessibility to the materials over the next 2 to 5 years?
Yeah, again, I think your perception is right there. Certainly, all materials are in short supply at the moment, and I struggle to comment over the next 2 to 5 years, to be honest, because that'll depend in part on shipping and competition throughout the country, particularly in terms of aggregates and things like that. But it's just another pressure on being able to deliver.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Roche?
The real one.
Thank you. Councillor Roche?
One more thing for you, Siobhan, recognising that you've only been here a short period. Just a little bit, how are we treating the Wellington Water work program insofar as it applies to Wellington? Because I'm concerned that some of the resources that we will be seeking in the market are also being sought by Wellington Water, and I'm just would like to know that we are coordinating the two, our various work programs, and treating them more like an affiliate than a competitor.
Yeah, that's a really good point, Sean. So for their renewals program, they have already partnered with Fulton Hogan to deliver a lot of that. It's for their new upgrade program that we are coordinating in as much as we know when their works are planned and when our works are planned. But you're right, we could potentially do more there in terms of seeing if there are any appropriate synergies we could use to ensure that we at least coordinate that work, but then maybe go even further to sharing contract resource, so we can definitely build on the work we're doing in terms of that overall network activity planning work that we're doing at the moment.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Condie?
Thank you. This is probably for you, Siobhan. I guess looking at the paper, I was certainly expecting there to be rescheduling out of this year and possibly next year, but I was actually surprised how much that $45 million worth of CapEx is being rescheduled outside of the 3-year window of the current LTP. And I guess what I'd like to understand is what options do we have to try and bring more of that work back within the first 3 years?
So the rescheduling was really based around what we can realistically deliver over the next 3 years, and realistically and ambitiously deliver over the first 3 years. So in terms of the options at the moment, we have got those mitigations that we're looking at, and I think it will really depend on the success of those mitigations to determine whether we'll be able to bring any of that capital spend back. So we are committed to going as hard as we can with this delivery, and making sure that we can resource up internally to support it, because it does require quite a lot of significant internal resource to support this, even though we have this outsource model. So we are committed to doing that, but at this point in time, that first 3 years is what we think is realistic at the moment.
Siobhan, can I just add to that? Jenny, from a finance perspective, we won't be putting any barriers up for the business if they have opportunities to bring forward activity if they're over delivering. So that, you know, we won't, just because this is how we are rescheduling the plan at the moment, if there's ways to accelerate it, finance will enable the bring forward.
Thanks. And I guess just as following on from your comment, Siobhan, you said earlier that we're not proposing to reschedule anything that's currently in delivery. But I guess my question is, are we proposing to reschedule any projects where design and planning is essentially finished and we could take it out to tender, but we're choosing not to?
No.
Okay. And then I guess the last question I have is about what options we have around the rescheduling if we would prefer to reschedule different things than what staff have identified. So I'm thinking particularly about cycleways has seen significant rescheduling, and the housing upgrades program has seen significant rescheduling. Are there different projects that we could reschedule instead if councillors decided we had different priorities?
So I think one point on the, so, you know, when we laid out that table, we wanted to show what that looked like within the life of the LTP. So that 45 million is a significant chunk of that sits in year 4, and particularly in cycleways. So the years 1 to 3 in cycleways is 25 million of a change, but actually when you load year 4 into that comes down to 9 million. So it is probably just a slight push out, and some of the delays we're seeing now will have a knock-on impact. So because the vast majority of that falls into year 4, I'm not sure that there's an awful lot of leeway to bring that back forward, but Brad might be able to help.
I think one of the reasons that those two work programs were looked at was simply because that's where the greatest risk lies. in terms of us being able to secure resources and materials to deliver. The other work programs, there are other things that we could reschedule, but those are things that where we've got resources secured, we've got stuff in train that is working and can be delivered. So rescheduling that and bringing forward the cycleways and the housing wouldn't really help us, because they were rescheduled because there's a real risk in those areas.
So if I could just paraphrase, I think what you're saying is that we could reschedule different programs and bring cycleways and housing back forward, but we would essentially be bringing high-risk project forwards and putting low-risk projects out, which seems counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, and that was a very good Q&A on that point. I've just got some questions. There are some. Oh, sorry, Deputy Mayor Free. I'll go to you. Sorry.
Thank you.
I crossed you off.
I just wanted to ask about the synergies with Build Back Better, and for example, the resealing program. Or somebody mentioned to me, for example, Ohara Road might be resealed. Is there a way of actually bringing some of our parts of our program, our cycling program, into that resealing program so that we can deliver? And maybe not in the order we plan to, but we do get stuff delivered.
So Build Back Better is very much in its infancies. It started off as a concept. We are working on improving our work program so that they do align better in terms of our resealing program, so that we can align it better to what the council's priorities are in terms of new cycleways and that sort of thing. When you look at this year's program, there's limited opportunities actually, because we started so late. So the areas where we're resealing don't quite align to where new cycleways are going to be going. We do have some internal work that we're undertaking for next year's work program. So hopefully from next year, we start to see those synergies working a lot better.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry. It was, my apologies to you, Deputy Mayor. So, look, I've just got a couple of questions just on, first up, Let's Get Welly Moving. I know there's some projects in there, the city streets and that smaller ones. How does this, what impact will this have on the agreement that we have with our partners with that, with potential delays in those pieces of work?
So I don't think it impacts the partnership agreement at all. But those impacts in terms of those delays are really around the establishment of city streets to make sure that that's actually set up properly for success. So it started off late in terms of when the IBC was approved and that board planning to make sure that they could deliver. So that's organisations all been done. So they're spending a lot of time in that planning phase so they can speed up delivery, which is exactly what we will be doing over the next little while here as well. And then also Golden Mile and Thorn and Key Hut Road, they will probably be delayed slightly, but I'm sure they'll work really hard to try and catch up on that. They've got a year's worth of detailed design to get through before they actually start construction. No impact on the relationship funding agreement. Okay,
thank you. And my next question is just about housing. And I noticed we have got some other team there, but it's one of the things is I know there was a one-liner around the Granville Flats and the balconies, and I thought that might be a health and safety aspect. So my general question is about some of these projects. Are we comfortable that that we can manage any health and safety and healthy home standard aspects?
So happy to answer that, Councillor Calvert. So Granville and Healthy Homes aren't affected by any of this rephasing proposals. So the Healthy Homes work is going along as it has done since the regulations came in. So all vacant units are being upgraded to Healthy Home standard. There's budget in there for the first 3 years of the LTP that will more than cover it. We have the main tender going out for the existing for units that have tenants in situ. That will be going out in January, and that is all running to plan so far, barring some potential supply issues, as we mentioned before. In terms of Granville, as you know, Councillor Calvert, we had to change our main contractor. Just working through that contract at the moment, but we were on site last Friday, with the contractors. We're sorting out a site office for them and work on that. All going to plan will start in January. So this isn't affected in any way by what's in this paper. And other work, like we've just completed the curtains project. That's a large CapEx project that was completed this month, and that's new curtains for all Hut 2 properties. And then in terms of Hut 2 itself, there's no delay to starting that. We're still in planning stage at the moment. And at the moment, we're getting DSAs, detailed seismic assessments, redone on all those properties to inform that decision making. So there's no safety risk, there's no asset failure risk for our portfolio at this time.
Okay, but there are some projects that have been pushed out a bit in the housing, from what I could see from the spreadsheet.
Not in terms of the phase we're at now. There's things like renewals, for example. We had a large renewals budget for this financial year, and are not going to be able to spend the full amount due to what was being talked about for some of the market constrictions, but also we've been concentrating on the healthy homes work. The renewals work is a large chunk of work, but we should be able to start that project in Q3 or Q4 of next year, but we're just not going to be able to spend the full amount with all the other capital projects that are underway. Again, there's nothing in that list of renewals that is failing currently and putting any tenants at risk.
I just wonder whether finance would like to comment, because there's a few lines on the spreadsheet. Yeah.
That's not a delay. But again, all of that.
Sorry, we can't hear Deirdre. Can we have a microphone on, please?
Sorry, I thought I'd pressed it. Sorry, so what I was saying was there is some delays. That's not putting any delay to the start or the planning of the project. It's just pushing out some of that work because we assume that the constraints we're seeing at the minute will have a knock-on impact. But again, all of that is still to be completed within the 10 years of the LTP.
Okay, thank you. And I've just got one final question before I go to Councillor Day, and that's about, we are 1 quarter or 3 months essentially into our 10-year plan, and already we're $80 million that we know we can't spend this current financial year. Is there any lessons that we could learn from this, given that we only signed off on a long-term plan in June, thinking we could do all this work? And I just wondered, have we missed something? Because it was signalled to us early in the year by officers of the infrastructure constraints in particular. So Siobhan's going to be in the hot seat on that one.
So yes, there are always lessons we can learn, obviously. In terms of what we are doing internally with our internal project management office, where we're looking now to get far better visibility over projects both planned and in delivery, that's going to set us up much better for resource forecasting the next LTP. However, these investments are... So we do have quite lumpy investments here. And actually trying to forecast that accurately is problematic. So I think there are lessons to learn, and we will apply them in the next LTP. But also we didn't foresee this latest round of COVID restrictions and the impact that has had on it, specifically around those ongoing border closures and that inability to actually bring resource into the country, which is playing out now. And also there's material supplies. So even if I think of some examples with St James and also Tarkina to a lesser extent, and some of the work that Brad's been working on in terms of the LED replacement program, trying to get crews down from Auckland has been incredibly problematic. Even for simple things like putting elevators in, we need an Auckland crew. So those things have sort of held us up. So those things we couldn't foresee at the time of long-term plan.
Thank you. And do you think that we're going into our annual plan considerations shortly? How will this information feed into that in any way?
So the rescheduling that we have proposed will become the base.
Are you
Yes. Will become the basis of the annual plan for next year, but also we will load that into our 10-year and 30-year forecasting as well.
Okay, and just one sort of final question: how can you keep this council up to date with the conditions? You know, because as we're moving through, I know we've got annual plan, but how do we continually adjust? What's the best way that we as governors can monitor this and support officers in probably some more difficult decisions that we're going to have to make coming up?
Yep. So for the Infrastructure Committee, we're going to be starting to report on priority projects. So we've got 28 priority projects that we'll start with. So they'll be coming to you in December, and that'll be ongoing reportings, just so that you can actually get some assurance. And that's the forum where we elevate those risks as well, which is, so you have the governance oversight of those risks, both existing and emerging.
And you'd also be using the quarterly reporting process to keep on track of actual delivery, and we will use that process as officers to highlight any risks or require any decisions from councillors.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. Councillor Day.
Kia ora. My questions follow on from Councillor Calvert's around the housing, the Healthy Homes Standard program, and just looking at it. So we're pushing out just over $2 million till year 24-25. Is there a risk that pushing it out that far means that if we start to be able to get ahead, that we've made that more difficult for ourselves? Because obviously that's quite a way down the track.
I'd love to, Councillor Day, say no, absolutely not. There's no risk there. Some things in terms of the front end of this, have caused us some delays. For example, 5 months to get heat pumps into the country. So there's also, we're waiting on a government decision around the multi-storey apartment blocks, because they're looking at potentially changing the heating tool. So if they change that heating tool, what that would mean is potentially $2.5 million off that cost of healthy homes for us. So that's quite an important change. So we did delay a couple of decisions based on that and put some of those larger apartment blocks to the back end of the program. It is a little bit risky, but the alternative was going in and fitting a heat source that wasn't required in, say, 6 months' time. So when they put the legislation together, it was based on single houses. And lots of people made submissions, including us, going, well, your multi-storey apartment blocks, if you imagine you're putting heat pumps, say, at Pukahino, Newtown Park, places like that you have to upgrade the electrical system, you have scaffolding, where are you putting the outdoor units? And when they've done the heating tool, what they've said is, a lot of that consideration wasn't factored in, like saying that, a lot of these units, especially our phase 1 properties, are all double glazed and don't require that level of heating. So we'll have that information in the next, they're saying, hopefully in the next 3 months. So yeah, there is a slight risk at that end point. But, we've got a really solid program in place now. We've got everything, all our ducks lined up in a row for as much as we possibly can. And when we go out for that main tender, we've changed our approach to it based on the market, and trying to make it as attractive as possible. Whereas it looked quite different a year ago when we're thinking of the initial way we'd approach this. So I'm confident we've got a good team on it. We've got good market advice, and if we got to the end, there's always the ability to apply for an exemption through MB if we needed, say, another 6 months or something along those lines.
So is that 2 million mostly around the heating, is it?
Definitely, because I think it's 2.3 million we estimated if we didn't have to go through with the heating tool. So it's a little bit of a risk, but a calculated one. And there's lots of other housing providers in the same boat waiting on this from central government as well.
Okay, thank you. I've got a couple of other questions just on some of the other bits. So Pōneke Promise, the streetscape, looks like we've about halved the money there for the first year and second year. What is that for? Just given the fact that Pōneke Promise is trying to really get going, and that we're still having issues and want to make sure that we're not losing effort that's being made. So what's that? What's the change? What's being delayed?
Councillor Day, can we quickly look at that for a second, maybe ask you a second question while we have a little look?
Sure thing. There's probably going to be similar ones like that as well. So the community centres.
Have you got it open though?
Yeah.
10:45.
Community centres was the next one. Deirdre, do you know anything about?
So without being completely across the detail, I think this refers to these projects that are still in the planning phase. So it's anticipating this issue with getting delivery resource both around the professional services and the physical works delivery. So, that's why we're saying we're concentrating very hard on making sure we can deliver what's in delivery, but for those things in the planning stage, there is very much a risk that we just won't be able to secure the resource to deliver to the previous timeframes.
Yeah. And I think when you look at those projects, they generally are coming out of this year, but that's being loaded into next year. And I suppose, again, it's to reiterate the point that Sarah made earlier, that if these things, we're not stopping anything. If these things spend quicker than we expected, then great. We will be coming to you through the quarterly report process, asking for that budget to be brought forward.
That's really encouraging. So the work will still happen on those things. The other ones, so were community centres, what's changing there? Is that part of the renewals or is it an upgrade? It looks like it's renewals, but
again, it's the same. It's the assumption that we're getting to that tender phase for some of those community centres, and some are in the planning phase, and that we anticipate that having a longer lead time than we did when we set the plan.
And then I guess just the last one, because the change actually isn't that much, but I'm just wondering where we're up to with it, is the playground renewals. Is that a supply chain?
Yes.
Challenge?
Again, it is the same issue. We're anticipating supply issues, and even Angelique's example of getting the heat pumps into the country and that taking 5 months. It's the same with any of the equipment that we need for those playgrounds. We're expecting that there will be a lag in that time, but again, hopefully we will be coming to you asking to bring back forward that budget.
Thank you. That one's not looking like it's been changed that much, so it's not huge. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other Councillor Fern?
Kia ora. So this is coming back to cycleways and possibly about how we're communicating it. So from a public perspective, they'll want to know how many kilometres will we be able to deliver over the next few years, and then I guess the question is, how will we communicate that to them?
So very much comes back to that detailed program planning, as referred to before, Laurie, around how once we get that detailed plan of which routes we're going to be planning to deliver by when, then we'll be able to do this communication. So again, if we adopt a similar approach to what City Streets has taken, where doing all of that upfront planning, spending the time doing that upfront planning really thoroughly so that we have a much greater confidence in what we can deliver, that's the point at which we'll be communicating.
Did you have another question?
Yes. So just to clarify, is one of the challenges or barriers, is this in-house or is it external resource that we're being constrained by? Both in-house. So is there any possibility we could employ more in-house? I know that's...
So that's underway with Liam's change, so there will be more coming in-house. What we just have to be mindful of is robbing Peter to pay Paul. So, if we don't want to be taking all the consultants in-house and then having no professional services to the actual design. So the actual design will still be outsourced. We'll use professional services for that. But the project management, the oversight, that facilitating the project will be done in-house. And engagement, yeah.
Deputy Mayor Free?
Yeah, I guess it's a little bit of a follow-up one from my wanting to build back better. The kind of thing that we've rolled out with Brooklyn, where it's, rubber dividers and hip posts, are those materials in short supply, or is that kind of thing readily available still?
Probably a question for Brad.
we're starting to have problems in getting that. We've started to procure early. So for the transitional cycleways, we're procuring stuff now, even though we don't have a finalized design, simply because there is a long lead time and the lead times are getting longer.
That is very reassuring. I want to know we've got a whole warehouse full of them somewhere, so that when we've got the opportunity, we can just go for it to get those kilometres, as Laurie said. Thank you. It should be a highly secure warehouse. We've just got 5 minutes to go, but Councillor Day, did you have your hand back up, or is it still? Yep. Go ahead, Councillor Day, then Councillor Condon.
Jenny did as well. She looks like she's before me.
I know you were actually had your hand up first, but it's up to you which way you want to go. Yeah.
Mine is very quick. It was just that it looks like a good news story in this around the streetlight transition. That we're actually putting more in to do that. What's the story behind that one?
So we're going to bring that forward.
It is.
Poniki promise.
Sorry, we can't hear. Don't think there's a microphone.
I think they're just looking at the spreadsheets. Yeah.
Cool.
In the streetlight space, we're actually pushing out projects, and that's linked to so the stuff that we're going to be doing this year is we're going to try and finish off Courtney Place this year for the Poniki Promise, but the rest of it we were waiting for. So we've got all the materials for the streetlights, but we don't have enough people to install them. So we had bargained on getting 2 crews from Auckland, but it's been months now and they haven't been able to get here. So we've actually pushed that out.
That's why I'm seeing that we've got the streetlight transition, which we're actually putting more money in this year. We were going to be doing 605,000, but we're going to be doing $1 million.
Sorry, that's between the LTP and the revised budget. So the LTP, there is an increase, which is part of the carry forward from last year. So we approved that in at the start of the year. Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I'm Councillor Condi.
Thanks. I just had a question about the Evans Bay cycleway, and it specifically said in the paper that there are some challenges around delivering that around the seawalls. And I guess just because we've just finished kind of consultation and it's going to be coming to us for a decision soon, can we just get a very quick update on why that project is not going to be able to be delivered as soon as we were hoping?
It's just that the amount of design work that we need to do for seawalls, we've realized is quite extensive. And so being able to secure the design consultants and the professional services to be able to do that is kind of what's limiting our ability to deliver that fast.
Thanks.
Is that all right, Councillor Conti? Did you?
Yes, thank you. That's useful to understand that it's just in the engineering side of it, that seawalls probably require specific seawall engineers, I imagine.
Okay, look, I'm just going to ask, sorry, Councillor Rush, one final question before I ask my final one.
Well, yeah, it's just a follow-up, and thanks, G, for raising it, because we learned from the seawall experience on Common Drive that it's much more expensive than cheaper. And this was pointed out to officers when we did the Evans Bay Parade paper. And I'm just wondering, do we actually have budget for these seawalls? Because that was a problem.
Additionally, we are going through a process. So I think there are 3 options which have varying levels of investment required over seawalls, but it's a trade-off between that level of service and the investment. So we're just working through that analysis as well, Sean. So that combined with that engineering is causing that delay. So we just have to make some decisions around that.
Thanks.
And just one final question from me, and it probably might be a bit of a patsy question to officers, but I'm presuming that this is what you're presenting to us as a package. So if we start wanting to tweak, that it's not ideal.
Please don't.
For those who are not in the room, officers are looking very concerned. Looking ill.
I think the risk there is probably the amount of time that it would take us to pivot to any further complicated changes to it. At this point in time, we're quite ready to just go And if it becomes too complicated, we spend a lot of time trying to work through that detail before we can actually get on with the delivery.
Could I also point out that, as I said before, the ones we've deferred are in planning, what we're keeping goes in delivery. I would be extremely reluctant to support stopping something that's in delivery so that we can focus on planning, because we won't be able to pick that up easily.
And officers will be pleased to know that elected members were quite keen to reduce their number of amendments going forward. So,
Discussion this morning.
all right. Well, thank you. It's coming. We're coming.
And we have to cross our fingers for no more lockdowns as well.
Well, yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, 90% party. Look, thank you all for being online. And hopefully that's answered the majority of your questions. Yes, so thank you all. And there's the next session about to start.
presentation on demographics. So I would just like to welcome the officers and Sense partners. John Stevens, welcome to you, kia ora, for coming along. That is your name, right? Stevenson, sorry, didn't have it in front of me. And Christopher Skavosky. Yeah, I just was saying the Polish is really, that is challenging. Anyway, it's wonderful to have you here. Thank you very much, Christopher, for sending us the presentation well in advance. It's very much appreciated. So we're just going to have about 20 to 25 minutes of presentation, and then councillors, if you could just put your hands up or send me a text, because I can just see a few people on screen at the moment for questions after that. Christopher, do you want to head off first? Kia ora.
Oh, lovely, thank you. So thanks for making time for us today. I realise how difficult it is to fit into a meeting like this at this time of year. So we're here to brief you on the population forecasting work done to date. Let's give you a little bit of an overview before we get into the real presentation. So historically, councils in the Wellington region have used third-party providers to give tailored forecasting services for population forecasting. This is because national agencies tend to lack the detailed data about a TA's local conditions, the kind needed for spatial and district planning purposes. So our previous supplier, Informed Decisions, exited the New Zealand market in 2019. So to find a replacement in time and to maintain consistency of approach across the region, the Greater Wellington Regional Council took the lead, initiated a process in early 2020 involving all the councils in the region. So this led to an RFP process, which resulted in Sense partners being awarded the contract by a panel comprising people from across councils. It was agreed in the first year that Sense partners would produce forecasts that are demand-led, with an implicit assumption that policy and infrastructure will be provided to enable the growth, and that they would also produce an online resource for us and the public to use, a resource that will appear on our website in the next couple of weeks. So the first year's work is complete, and each council currently has their forecast for future planning. I say future because I understand that the district and spatial plans were based on the figures that we'd arrived at through the Planning for Growth kaupapa when Forecast ID was our service provider. Sure. Oh, sure. Okay. So we are currently working with our colleagues and the other councils and Sense partners to plan the first round of updates. So this is the first year, but we recognize a lot has happened in the past few months, so we need to start preparing for those updates. So for the real technical stuff now, I'm going to hand over to John Stevenson to take you through the work. Able to do it?
Yep. All right, thanks, Christopher. So before I get into it, I'll do a small amount of apologies, which is that although I've cut down the numbers considerably in terms of the content, it's unavoidable that we're going to have a little bit of number soup for this sort of work. I try and keep it to a minimum. A small piece of context going into the projections. So the project itself, I'll just give you a sense of the scope. So oh, you like that? Oh, the coffins. Yeah. Yeah, I won't step through the machinations of what these things are symbolising, but yeah, well, that's right. So the scope is to look at demographic projections going forward out 30 years. Base year is 2018 because that's where the census is, that's where your best data is. We look at the demographics, people, how that evolves over time. One of the things which falls out of doing a people-based projection is you can start to look at labour force participation rates, project those, look at labour force. That then carries over to things like income. So that's sort of captured within the project, although it's not a central focus. Then a really key part of the moving from people to essentially housing demand, so the key focus is to figure out how people coalesce into households, how that might evolve over time, project the number of households, and that then has implications for housing. We don't do a complete projection of the supply side, right? It's not a detailed bottom-up forever for the next 30 years. Where will the houses exactly be built? In the sense that, as Christopher says, it's demand-led. So it's more about thinking about numbers of people and households, and putting those bits of information into the hopper alongside the more technical elements of planning, et cetera, which is not necessarily what we are producing in this project. So moving to the projections themselves. Which one?
Can people use microphones, please?
Okay, no, hang on.
I can explain.
Yeah. If you,
New kind of, I'm not used to this kind of presentation.
Nicola, can you just, have you definitely got your microphone on so it's very clear what you're asking?
It's not pointing at me.
Okay.
So it's just to give us a quick, not a detail, but just a quick so we know what it is we're looking at.
Across each of the elements?
Like people and households, are you saying those people, I mean, I just don't quite get what it's saying.
Oh, in terms of the overall scope. So once you've done your bits and pieces on people to count up what kinds of people there would be based on assumptions around people coming, around births and deaths, and then movements with the rest of the world, that gives you your population. Then you've got a bunch of people, but those people then coalesce into particular types of households, whether that be a person living alone, a coupled household, a single parent with children, and so on. That's that second. So you're categorising people into their living arrangements, from which then you have housing demand. Yeah. So we start, and our projections, our methods, our models are essentially detailed district by district for the whole country models. But obviously, the natural starting point is
Can't hear anything here in Roseneath.
Yeah, sorry. Can't hear anything.
Oh, you mean, sorry.
Is that okay now, people? Can you hear me?
Yeah, must have been an accident.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so but obviously we're starting with a national, implicitly starting with a national level projection. It's quite a useful way to think about what the overall projections are saying. Our projections, and what I've done with each of what I'm going to go through, I'll start at the national, go through the regional, and then into the Wellington city, just to give the context. The national projections, in each case for the projections, I've mapped them against a comparable set of forecasts, because in this case, Stats NZ. This is because Stats NZ is always the natural comparator when you do a projection. People will always come back and say, how does that look relative to Statistics New Zealand, and why? So this very simple summary, we've got a chart here with the history of population growth nationally, compound annual average growth rates, and then projections for the subsequent 30 years from 2018 in 10-year blocks. And we've got the percentage changes with Sense Partners projections in the grey bars, and the blue in the Stats NZ's projections. Essentially, the summary here in terms of our projection is that we are fractionally higher in the short term than the average of the past 20 years for the national numbers, so 0.1% higher, from which the projections then begin to decline, and that's principally due to the ageing of the population and the reduction in the natural rate of change in the population, the difference between births and deaths. For much of the country, you're in negative territory on that metric. We are substantially different to Stats NZ in general, at least its medium projection, where Stats NZ has rather rapid and substantial decline in the rate of growth in the population. The principal difference in that is that our projections have, in behind all the numbers, our projections have a 0.7% contribution from net migration to population growth over the next 30 years. That's the average of the historical rate, so it's a continuation of historical trend at 0.7%. Stats NZ projects 0.1% annual contribution to population growth from immigration, and so they have substantially lower population growth in their medium track, I should say. The other thing is that our assessment, all of our assessments are probabilistic, run our models many times with different variations on assumptions in order to assign ranges for uncertainties, because of, uncertainties everywhere, and it's nowhere more so than in population projections. So I've got a little table there of the range of percentiles of projections. Stats NZ does a similar thing, very similar methodology to ours, in fact, largely indistinguishable. And you can see the range of different outcomes. A key difference from us is that we have a wider range of possibilities than Stats NZ. We've got a similar level of downside, so you can look at the numbers just, for example, at the 5th percentile. You've got a 0.4% growth rate nationally in our projections and 0.4% in Stats. Really where the differences align is on the potential upside. We've got higher potentials. Stats NZ's potential growth rate is relatively low. So you can see in our 95th percentile, we've got 2.2, they've got 1.5. 1.5 is only 0.2 above the mean of the last 20 years. So that, in my views, are a fairly pessimistic view of the upside. And for those who are statistically minded, that 0.2 difference from the mean of the past 20 years is only half of one standard deviation. So it's not, in any case, they don't have as broad a range of outcomes in their numbers as we do. Now, I mentioned that the key difference is that we have a different view on migration. Specifically, and we don't actually model net migration in the sense that what we actually do is project immigration and emigration. And then look at the difference. Stats doesn't, they just pick a net number. Somewhat immaterial really, because you can still end up at a net number and you can look at what the differences are. So I've got this chart here, and perhaps without going through all the bullets on here, is quite a bit of words for people to mull, and you've got that material. So really just to focus on this particular chart on net migration, it sums up much of the key drivers of population growth in our forecast. So this chart tracks net migration into New Zealand as a proportion of the global population, which is a nice little measure of the kind of sink from which we draw our migrants or immigrants. And you can see what the trends have been from the past and where our projection lies. Our projections, I think, in terms of, well, if you want to see where the projections start, you actually need to look and see where the 25th and 75th percentile, those little dashed lines, where they actually begin. It's actually back at 2020, or actually, sorry, 2019. We don't have that, so there's a large spike in immigration that we had through to 2020. That's not actually in our projections because those actuals came to light too late in the piece for our projections, which were finalised in April. But nonetheless, so you've seen how high things have gone in the past. Where they've averaged, they have been down. It's a huge amount of volatility in the history, including from the aftermath of the global financial crisis and the earthquakes in Christchurch, both of those things coalescing to have negative impacts on net migration. Our view would be that track that we have, which is around about 40,000 people a year, is pretty unremarkable in terms of its track, but it is nonetheless substantially higher than Stats NZ's median net migration assumption, which is around 20,000, so around half what ours is in the net terms. But you can see it's sort of, relatively low relative to what we've seen in the past, and certainly compared to the very long-run average trends, particularly in inward migration. The other thing to notice on this chart is those dashed lines showing the ranges, the 25th to 75th percentiles of our projections, so the models that we fit to explain immigration and emigration. We simulate those with natural variation and rerun the models, and this is the sort of range that you get. So it's a not trivial bound of uncertainty that's captured in the modelling, and it goes obviously further than the 25th to the 75th percentile. It goes out into the 5th to the 95th and so on. But so even in that bound, there's quite a lot of uncertainty. So unlike the national projection, where really certainly in the near-term projections for the national population are not far off what we've seen in the last 20 years for the next 10 years, the Wellington region numbers are noticeably different. Okay, so you can sort of see there that we've got the last 20 years, 1% growth on average in the Wellington region. And we've got growth over the next 10 years up around 1.6%. Stats has growth declining, so we're twice as strong for the Wellington region as Stats NZ. And then we are declining in these projections as for the national, same as for Stats NZ, but we've still got, a fairly chunky, around 0.8, 0.6% difference in our growth rates relative to Stats NZ. Our 1.6% in the next 10 years, which is sort of a good indication, it's the jumping off point for our higher numbers. That 1.6% is equal to the rate of growth that we've actually seen in the Wellington region over the last 7 years. So in that sense, it's not a massive departure, but what you see is that the last 7 years' growth was a substantial departure. For every district except for Wellington City, the last 7 years was a substantial departure from what we'd seen for a very long time. So large parts of the Wellington region really didn't grow much at all on trend in the last 20 odd years.
Oh.
Up to 2020. Yeah.
Sorry, can you just repeat the question, John?
When I say the last 7 years, so it's up to, in the last 7 years, it's actually from the last census up to 2020, is what I was talking about. So, in a sense, trying to pull out the difference from COVID. The key, Hutt City, Upper Hutt City, Masterton, Porirua, all have seen quite remarkable differences in growth or increases in growth, and it has been quite remarkable when you pick back through planning documents of only the last 3 or 4 years, 2 or 3 years, how projections how wrong expectations have been about population growth. The interesting thing for me, and one of the more recent Lower Hutt planning documents, they were discussing how the population had been growing faster than they thought, but they thought it would reach a higher level in the next 10 years at higher rates of growth. But in fact, unbeknownst to them, since they'd finalised the projections, their population had already reached the population they thought they'd have 10 years in the future. So essentially what ended up happening is between 2017 and 2020, Lower Hutt had more than 15 years worth of growth in those 3 years, if you were to take their expectation for growth from their planning and strategy documents. So it was a massive shock. There's definitely a question about whether or not those particular trends are going to continue. They came for many people out of nowhere. My sense is that they didn't come out of nowhere, and that they were, many of them, predictable. But the predictability of those changes, so in the next slide I've got the predictability of those changes, it I think behooves anyone to not get carried away with oneself and claim too much in terms of being wise after the fact. So just to emphasise that even though they did have really strong growth, it is still highly uncertain about how that will continue. And our projections for the region do assume a degree of continuation of the more recent trends. Okay. And the key thing to note in this table, again, it's definitely number soup, is the key driver through the region is net domestic migration. So there's a breakdown here in the components of population change, and you can see 1.1% growth for the region from net migration, and then breaks down further into the domestic change, net domestic change 0.7%, the net international change 0.4%. So that 0.7 on the domestic migration is the key driver. And then if you look below that, you'll see in-migration running at 4.8% contribution to population change per year, and out-migration's running at negative 4.1. Okay, so we're modelling each of these flows separately. So in the context of flows between 4 and 5% on the in and the out, 0.7 is actually a reasonably small margin to play with. And when you're in a district, particularly like, say, Hutt City, where actually they haven't grown very much, it doesn't take very much of a change in the gap between those two flows for you to look like you're all of a sudden having strong population growth. But equally, the opposite is true. Right? So actually, if those two flows moving in opposite directions actually begin to get closer, you can tip back into zero. So in a sense, much of Wellington region's seen itself on the other side of a tipping point, moving from around fairly flat growth into very strong growth. So in a sense, it's on a knife edge. It is a tight margin. And you see this all over the country where people have consistently underpredicted the population of basically not the main cities. because they've consistently thought that the margin can't grow. It has to sit at close to zero, or in some cases, consistent predictions of populations declining when they haven't actually declined. Horowhenua is a really good example of that. Live in, right, grew massively, fastest growing population for over 100 years, is in the top 10 fastest growing. Then it collapsed. Then it was flat, and then people just assumed it would keep on being flat without looking at the components and the machinations of growth to consider that you can actually get faster growth. Well, that's also true. But it's also called high house prices in Palmerston North. Yeah. So moving into Wellington City, where the story's is quite different for the region, in the sense that while the near-term projections look pretty strong for the region, the near-term projections for Wellington City are, I would claim, fairly unremarkable, at least relative to the past 20 years. So for the next 10 years, we've got a 1.2% growth from 2018, and that's what we saw in the previous 20 years. Stats NZ has a fairly rapid decline from that historical trend down to 0.7%. Again, the difference between our view and stats persists through time, and we've both got similar changes in our growth rates through time. But that gap persists, where our numbers look much more like the numbers of the past. I should note too that when I was mentioning the Hutt's numbers and the enormous difference between what they actually got and what they thought they'd get, Wellington's not the same. It is true that the numbers have been under projected, or have been higher than expected, say relative to the housing and business demand assessment, which was completed in 2019-2020. What we've actually seen in the population between 2017 and 2020 is an extra 2,000 people we didn't think we'd have. That's only an extra year of growth. So in those 3 years, there were 4 years of growth rather than the 3 that were expected. Of course, over a long period of time, those small differences can grow to be large differences, because over 15 years, you're going to get 20 years worth of growth if you don't consider, or if you win, as and when your projections are wrong. And our numbers, again, talking about the housing and business development capacity assessment as a benchmark, because that's what some of our work was feeding into. Our numbers look very, very similar to the kinds of growth rates that were in the high case, so the Stats NZ high case, that were used in 2019. So again, projecting a faster rate, but only relative to previous relatively soft projections. Now, returning to a theme, just to give you a sense, the next slide's got a very simple summary of the key drivers in the breakdown of population growth and comparison here between New Zealand and Wellington City. A really key, you'll see just by glancing at the grey lines, which are just smooth lines through census observations going back to 1981. You'll see that both New Zealand and Wellington City have got your declining rates of natural population increase, both positive but trending down. Wellington's been a little bit higher than Wellington City's been higher than the national. That's pretty stable. It's hard to think, what more you would do with those projections. They don't look like they're departing very much. The projections being to the right of that vertical blue dashed line. Yep. Scroll up. Oh, yeah. Sorry. Yeah, in these predictions, these charts are compressing a lot of time into a chart. So it's actually spanning, 30 years from 2020 or 30 years from 2018 and all the way back from 2018 to 2021. Key point being on the natural rate of increase is pretty stable, or fairly predictable. The migration numbers obviously move around a great deal. So the way to look at that is if you look to the blue line or the dash to the blue line, just to the left of that there's a grey and a blue dot kind of on top of each other. That was your contribution to population increase between from the 2018 census, the average across 5 years. It was up above 0.5%. That's fairly solid. This is total net migration in terms of internal flows and international flows. That looks pretty strong, but if you track back to 2013, the contribution to population change in Wellington from migration was negative, not large negative, but negative. Then if you track back again to 2016, go one dot back, and you can see the dot that's just sitting, the blue dot just sitting above the grey line of Wellington City, it jumped up to being near 1%. So clearly that's moving around a lot. But you get occasional small negatives, large negatives, and going right back to the early 80s, and there's a whole bunch of things going on, or in the mid 80s going on in New Zealand, where you've got very large negatives. And this all comes together in this sort of a chart where, it again behooves us to think about the wide range of uncertainties that exist whenever we're thinking about the future, planning for the future, investing for the future. And there's the chart on the left here has got the range in the population projections. And on the right, I've got the change in the number of households relative to 2018. The one on the right's, I think probably a little more useful from a council point of view, and actually from a social policy point of view, because ultimately we coalesce into households and share our resources and so on. So it's the key unit of account for most social and public policy. And you can see the very wide range of differences. So there's a 1 in 20 chance in our projections, and that's in our projections with our model of zero growth rate, zero growth in the number of households. Households, and if you've seen discussions of demographic projections, are probably at any point over the last 20 years, you will have heard about the ageing of the population and certainly about the shrinking of household size that goes with an ageing of the population. The household numbers get a bit of a kick from the shrinking of household size. So the population growth numbers there's a 1 in 20 chance of a negative of the population shrinking in our modelling, but with slightly more households per person. You're getting no growth in 1 in 20. And then in between the 25th and the 75th percentile, you've got a range of growth rates coming out of the model between 0.6 and 1.6% year on year. So that, given that those growth rates accumulate, you can see some of the population differences. So that's a difference of between 16,000 additional households in Wellington City in 2048, or 51 and a bit thousand households in 2048. So it's quite a span, but it reflects what we know from looking at history in terms of how much variance you see in the world, and how wrong you would be if you just put a single line through the numbers. So that's the ultimate range. How are we looking for time?
How much more have you got to go? Sorry, I can't remember from your presentation.
There's 4 more slides, I think.
Okay, no, I think it is useful to talk through this one in this case. So, yep.
Yeah. Okay. This was actually the one I was possibly going to skip, but so because I think these are really persistent. One of the good things about demographics is that much of the information you can get is actually highly predictable in terms of trends. Given that the people in the population, the people who are going to be 75, 20 years from now, they're pretty much, most of them already live here. We can already go and see them and we can talk to them. So it's not like other phenomena in the sense that it's quite inert. The bigger your city is, the bigger your country is, the less the more inert it is. Smaller you are, the more fragile, the more volatility. But even so, there's quite a bit of predictability. And so when it comes to things like population ageing, you get very significant, very predictable trends in the ageing of the population. So you've really got population growth. The majority of it is coming out of the older age populations and retirement age and so on. And the fastest rate of growth by age group is people over the age of 80. So that's a substantial ageing of Wellington City's population. One of the more interesting things for Wellington that you don't see in other districts of the country is the stagnation that you get in the younger ages. So not the 10 to 19, but if you think sort of the ages of 20 to 30, a lot of people in their early 20s come to Wellington, and a large number of them leave. Okay, so they don't stick for a long period of time. So if you have high rates of immigration, that just keeps getting topped up, get more and more people, and you can see in the chart on third from the top, third from the left on the top row, you can see that at the last census there was a bit of a kick up in that 20 to 29-year-old population, largely reflecting what that very large rate of international net migration that we had. That really affects, Wellington's very exposed to international migration. And lifted that cohort. But then you've got really our projections, even with our 40,000 per year on average net migration into the country, that population group shrinks its percentage of the population. In total number, we project it, on average, to basically be flat out to 2038, maybe a bit of an increase in 2048.
So can you just explain why 20-year-olds don't stay around? Is it just because of high house prices, or is this a long-term trend?
No, this has been a trend for a long time. So it's things like one of the largest population sources for Wellington City has been historically 20-year-olds coming out of Otago. So it's people who go train in Otago and they come to Wellington for the first job. Then inevitably they're off on an OE and they may or may not ever return. A lot of other places in the country do have people who, they have large inward migration in the 30s, people in their 30s. As people from the Hawke's Bay go off at the age of 18 and then they end up going to university and then they go overseas or some other form of training, or they go to Auckland for a job, often when they have children they go back home. A large population addition happens to Wellington because of the nature of the city, the industries, government and so forth. People aren't necessarily firmly attached to the city, so when they do go off and do the same trips or try out some other form of other places to live, they don't naturally return to Wellington, they potentially naturally return to the Hawke's Bay. So there is this it's very robust. If you think about the numbers I was showing you before with 4 and 5% in rates and 4 and 5% out rates, and then the differences being 0.7, it's an order of magnitude larger with the population in that sort of an age group. And when we have very robust migration, we get a kind of an equilibrium level of population in those younger ages. And when our migration falls, you can't maintain, or you certainly don't grow the share of the population, which is in your 20s. Now, that's not to say that these dynamics can't change. It might be different into the future, but certainly based on the sorts of in and out dynamics we see historically, this is the sort of result that you get. It does make Wellington, makes Wellington really stand out. It's quite interesting. It's in that sense, it's a more dynamic city from a migration point of view. On the housing demand assessment, I thought actually, rather than pick through the numbers, which I think people will have particular interest in particular areas, and frankly, I'm probably not, the best person to talk to a specific suburb, given that I want to just mention how we go about our housing demand assessment that flows from our projections of numbers of households. Quite critically, what we do is we fit models that predict, that estimate statistical relationships between a particular household type, particular dwelling type, and particular areas. Right? So we pick up things like, do couples without children, do they prefer standalone dwellings or apartments? Historically, we pick, do they prefer living in Karori or do they prefer living in Mount Victoria? So, and that's statistically, and that's looking at history. And then essentially what we do is say, well, now we've got more couple households or fewer couple households. What's the margin of where they would like to live? On top of that, we overlay constraints. Not everybody can live where they want to. And we use the housing and business capacity assessments from 2020 to basically say, no, you can't all live there, because a statistical model will tell you everyone wants to have certain, the standalone dwelling in Mount Victoria, for example, and they can't. So then you reallocate people to what sort of their next best choice might be. But it's not, that really fixes, assessments of where people live and what they want to live based on what you've seen historically. So it doesn't take into account that urban form will change when people put in new transport projects. It doesn't take into account any form of facilitative measures where people want to make a neighbourhood, give it stronger immunity. Correct. So essentially what it's doing is saying, look, this is the sort of quantum of demand. But I think this is why it's a demand side assessment. If we were to, essentially, if we were to take account of all the potential policies that could come into place over the next 30 years, there would be a strong sense in which we'd be prejudging what is essentially not within the remit. So ultimately, one should take the numbers. Oh, down? Oh, up.
It has been sent to you on your email, so you can look at it at your computer, if that's helpful.
So I just want to make that general point. I mean, that's the thing with these kinds of models, is that they are always methods for reasoning about what might happen. And, particularly if they're inputs to a thinking and decision-making process, they shouldn't necessarily prejudge that process. So we did try to take account of changes in development capacities to some extent coming through things like the MPSUD, but the MPS was, the assessment of that and its implications were insufficiently mature for us to sort of do line by line. And it's not clear that you necessarily want us to do line by line assessments on what ought to change on the supply side, seems to me. But and in that vein, and I think this should be my last slide, there's a lot of things in here that one needs to think about. So there's unmeasured risks, and this is risks in the investor sense. They're not all of them bad. They just mean things that would make me wrong. We hold a lot of things constant. Again, we also don't prejudge immigration policies. So policy change is a big thing. So urban development policies can change. We did our projections, demographic projections in April. There's been non-trivial moves on the part of central government in urban development space very recently. These are not in here, and they're obviously a risk to what we think will happen in terms of the distribution of development into the future. We made some tweaks to give a bit more of a kick in development to Porirua on account of the fact that they had consented very large land for development quite recently, sort of towards the beginning of this year. But are they going to continue to have the comparative advantage of large greenfields if under the recent changes to central government moves on development? I don't know. I haven't thought about that really hard. I just know that it's a risk to the projections. And immigration policies, changes of productivity commission review, which they don't normally have much effect on government, but could do. And government definitely has been signalling a willingness implicitly to constrain migration. We don't put that into our projections because there are no policies to that effect yet. But if there are, that's going to change the view. There's a whole bunch of other ones which I think are really important for planning, and particularly tipping points or rapid reversals. I mean, obviously you get that with things like COVID, and then there's just a question of how that will persist. But climate policy is not trivial, right? And there's a major trade-off there between people getting into electric cars and maybe they get to drive further, and maybe we can keep to have some sprawl, and maybe that's not going to be effective. And are we going to build some more PT? And when will let's get Wellington moving, really hit its straps? How will that change urban form? What will that mean for the desirability of living in Wellington City? Climate policies for me is a really key one around people's preferences for and supply of PT. And also large reductions in land or property prices. So definitely we've seen a drive into the periphery, all over the world, but also and all over New Zealand as people flee high property prices. So that could really shift the balance of distribution of the population within Wellington, whether it is Porirua or Wellington City. And the path for global recovery post-COVID. So that's a really non-trivial. We've just entered our process of doing our annual update for the projections. So this sort of be a 3-month process. And that's a point at which, basically COVID's turned out to be worse. I think we were hang of a lot more optimistic in April or March, when we were landing our assumptions, than when Delta really started to become a significant threat. Definitely the borders are going to be shut materially for longer than we anticipated. We did have border closure. We had the same border closure assumptions essentially as Stats NZ. But everybody's been wrong-footed by the extent to which Delta has meant, quite a reasonable but strong degree of risk aversion on the part of government and with respect to the border. So the question now, those are all short-term things. They shouldn't overly impact our view over the longer term. It's more about what's going to happen how are we going to unwind out of the border closure situation? Okay, what's the damage to the global economy going to look like? What's that going to mean for people's ability and willingness to want to move to New Zealand? Are we going to continue to be a relatively interesting place to go to? How are our education providers going to fare? Because education provision has been smashed all over the world in terms of international exports, and this is really critical for this city, right? And we might think, well, that'll come back, but will we facilitate it coming back? If we don't do things to facilitate it, will it be the case that other people who, the American tertiary provision and export education has been massively more affected than ours? Huge numbers of layoffs that we've sort of kept at bay. Will they pounce into the freer post-COVID world and bring people in? And then what will that mean for New Zealand if our export services don't function? So I mean, this is all colour in the sense that I don't have answers for those things. It's just that right now feels like one of the weirder times to have been trying to put together demographic projections when people just went, oh, by the way, you can't come to New Zealand for the first time since data, and we started counting these things in the 1920s. It does make things a little bit challenging. So everybody should feel a little bit sorry for the people having to do the modelling. But that's my yes.
Oh, well, look, thank you so much. That is incredibly helpful. We've now got questions from the Mayor and Councillor Young, and I'm sure others will ask too. So maybe 3 questions, Mayor Foster, and then you can go back on the list.
Yeah, migration policy is one of my pet topics. So you've got no visibility into what government's thinking other than what they've made public, in the sense of that they are thinking about it in a slightly more constrained approach. But from our point of view, in terms of planning, it would be profoundly useful. I've said this for about 30 years, but profoundly useful that if we actually had some sort of visibility about what they're actually intending to do. Would it not?
Is that a question?
Would it not? Would it not? It's got nothing to do with elections.
Oh, is it material?
Well, I mean, that would be pretty useful for our planning, wouldn't it?
Yeah, okay, except I just don't think Sense Partners is going to have any more insight into the government policy.
Right. Second one is, what are your assumptions around economic growth and activity? And that's Wellington versus New Zealand, and New Zealand versus Australia, anywhere else. What's built into this?
So it's a fairly BAU flavoured assumption. In the near term, it's based off Treasury projections. So everything flows from the people, and then into what do you think the unemployment rate will be, and so on, interest rates, inflation. When we do our migration projections, we put those into the model. As discussed, actually our projections on migration were used in the BFU by the Treasury in 2018. So if anyone wants to pick through Treasury's discussion on migration issues, you'll see some of the discussion of what we used, and a working paper on their site. But basically, it is a fairly vanilla. What does the Aussie Treasury think? And we focus principally on how well is the New Zealand economy going, right, in our modelling.
Yeah.
And what does essentially Treasury think? And we use Treasury numbers because we don't want to be additionally controversial by naysaying Treasury as whilst also naysaying Stats NZ. But we use similar Aussie projections, and then we look at the balance between the two. So it is very much in the median. It's a kind of Goldilocks around what will happen to the economy. Then we do our simulations in which we actually look at what's going to happen essentially when our unemployment rate jacks up, and what would that then imply for net migration. So it's not a number. It's sort of a model about how things will evolve.
We're assuming that broadly we're roughly similar in terms of our standards of living compared to other countries where people could choose to come, go to, etc.
Well, broadly speaking, although you'd have to say that I think the key margin is our standard of living relative to the rapidly growing middle classes outside of our more traditional immigration sources.
I understand what you're saying. Yeah, cool. And look, from allowed 3 questions, the last one is just around the housing location one. To the extent that we are deliberate about saying we are going to try and actually create housing ourselves or with the state, that would presumably drive more development to particular areas rather than other areas?
Yeah, completely, of course, and would have effects on other parts of the region because of the very close borders.
That's a very live discussion at the moment. So yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you, Councillor Young, then Councillor Foon.
So I mean, I did send through a whole lot of questions yesterday.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, yes, I've got you on the list
I'm
too.
not sure if you can see us, but we've got Terry and Jenny here. Sorry,
Yes,
Nicola.
I've got you on the list, and I'll put Jenny on. Thank you. Thank you, Councillor Young.
So I just don't want to grind through all those questions now. Could we perhaps do it later on rather than tie you up? And because I've got some really basic ones as well. The first one is, where are the migrants going to come from?
We don't model the specific individual countries. We basically have a pool of people. So this is I can only give you the technical answer, which is to say that our...
I was thinking really of internal migration.
Oh, internal migrants. All over.
They're coming for the climate?
Well, that's interesting too. It's an interesting question. So they have been, it is interesting that they have been arriving, obviously less so into Wellington City in recent times. Obviously a bunch of them are international, but if it's domestic, a large chunk from Auckland. I don't have the numbers offhand. I can tell you what we do, which is model the probability of a person leaving a district in New Zealand, at each individual age and sex. And then we have the probability that if a person leaves a district, what's the probability they go to any of the other districts? So it is possible to pick back out through that essentially mix of enormous sort of map of probabilities to show exactly where we're essentially modelling the people as having come from.
Okay.
Within the Wellington region, the movements within the region itself are enormous. I mean, if you kick, one of the interesting things is when we did give a kick to the population movement into Porirua by basically robbing some of the population from Wellington City and putting it into Porirua, you then get a subsequent kick into the population of Kapiti sort of 10 years down the track, because the probability that a person, particularly middle-aged person, is likely to move to Kapiti from Porirua is substantially higher than the probability that a person in Wellington moves into Kapiti.
So just looking at the last pages, which haven't been in your extra supplement, the secret supplement at the back. Wellington, looking at the various areas like Kapiti, Marsden, etc., Wellington has the lowest anticipated growth rate of any of those areas.
Yep.
So I just don't. So my concern is, what underpins my concerns is that the population and forecast population growth for Wellington is much higher than is realistic, and thinking that in previous years, and I wish I'd made a note of it, but it wasn't that long ago when people expected the population in Wellington by 1972 to be 750,000, so forecasts aren't always that accurate. And my concern is, as a Lambton councillor in the city, with Thorndon, Mount Victoria, Mount Cook, I'm concerned about the character areas being changed enormously, and once they've gone, they've gone. So I don't want to have housing. I don't want to cater for housing which may not be necessary. That's the guts of it.
Yeah. Well, I think one thing I would say is that certainly it has been a non-trivial change for Wellington City to be growing more slowly than the Hut. But that's what's happened, and there's a degree to which we've extrapolated that to continue. And we don't really have any other information to the contrary. So essentially that's what we end up with. And that's why I point people back all the time to saying, look, any point numbers are not necessarily likely to be true. It could reverse itself. Although most of the things we heard from our extensive consultation and discussion with the other councils around what was happening in their districts, pre-middle of this year, pre-Delta getting really bad, still enormous amounts of development going on, people interest, people moving there, growth. So it does seem to be persisting, and something's changed, and that is reflected in the numbers, with Wellington having a slower growth rate than the region. From here, 1.2% growth over the next 10 years and then declining. I just don't think that's large. It will remain to be seen what's going to happen on the relative price of people choosing to live in Porirua or somewhere else. It may well be that Wellington increasingly prices people out of the market, such that maybe the population won't grow that fast, but that'll be a consequence of, amongst other things, supply choices, or supply side choices or policy choices that aren't for me to...
Talking to people, this is my third question, talking to people like property developers, I was talking to some yesterday, So there's quite a lot of movement to move their work away from Wellington, their development, and it's not so much about the price, but it's about the threat of the huge question mark over let's get Wellington moving and the effect that will have on their businesses. It's impossible for you to take that into account, isn't it? Because it's all very unknown.
No, it's not impossible. I think it's not something that you want to do if you're trying to cast a view of future potentials, where you can be clear that the basis upon which you're producing them, and this is a range of outcomes. What you can do, however, is think about scenarios. So in our numbers, we do in a way have a scenario because we did allow for the fact that Paeroa was very sure that they had a huge amount of development capacity that was going to be taken up. And, I think, and discussions across the range of councils involved, the people thought, it doesn't make sense to be quite so bullish on Wellington City when there is that additional development capacity out there. So small amendments were made to the assumptions. But equally, I think, and it's something we're considering for future development, talking to Greater Wellington about, is actually to run more scenarios. So right now, this is very statistically driven, trend driven, a lot of detail, but still it's very trend driven. But it's entirely possible to think, okay, yeah, but what would a particular transport project do? And run scenarios on that basis so that you can then say, oh, we think this would be the margin of effect versus that's the margin of effect. But that's sort of it's a different process. I mean, it's similar to if you were doing thinking about a spatial plan and thinking about different parameters for your plan and where people might actually end up going. Well, you want to run scenarios on that. And this is not that.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you. So if we could just maybe speed up a little bit, succinct questions. Councillor Foon and then Councillor O'Neill.
2 quick questions. Just if you could go over the household slide again just for me. I just didn't quite grasp what that was about. And then how do you account for the migrations in terms of student populations?
Do you mean the slide at the very beginning, just showing the pictures, or the numbers for Wellington?
We can't hear.
Sorry, can you? Yeah.
Sorry, in terms of the that one. Thank you.
Oh, right. So just the extent to which the number of households grows faster than the number of people. Yeah. So if you think about it just on a houses per capita basis, as people age, there's two key margins in the aging of the population. One is the increased number of couple households, which is something we've seen now, and so lots of people between the ages of, I don't know, let's call it 50 to 65 or something, or probably 50 to 70, no children in the household. So if that's your margin of growth, then you're going to need fewer houses to house them into the future. As people, particularly as older people age and particularly partners pass away, then you get more people living alone. That's actually a huge margin of growth, by the way, not just for aging reasons, but there's huge numbers of people not well counted in the census who live alone. And the more of them you get, the more, it's got sort of the archetypical 85-year-old female who's widowed. You get more of them, fundamentally need more accommodation units per person in the population. It's not enormous, right? We're talking about changes from like 2.6 people per household on average down to say 2.4. So it's not the big margin of change, but it's noticeable.
And the students?
Oh, students, in terms of how they live together.
Can you speak directly into your microphone? Sorry.
Just the student year, and then they go home for holidays. Yeah. How does that fit into this?
Yeah, an imprecise answer, I'm afraid. Some of them are counted as residents and some of them are not. So the students that are here largely most of the time when it comes, the only thing we've got that can help us understand these things is the census. Census will categorise you as resident and where you say you're resident. And ultimately, that can mean if you've just recently moved to Wellington, then but you think you'll go home for the holidays to your parents in Whangarei, then you are likely to be counted as resident in Whangarei. So it's inevitably imprecise. Students who have been here for a while will typically be resident because they spend most of their time in Wellington, will be counted as resident in Wellington.
Thank you. Councillor O'Neill.
Thank you. Two parts are connected to one another. My first question is around how we measure our poorer demographics in our city, such as houses that have a lot of overcrowding, how we measure homelessness or people that have been placed into emergency housing and taken away from their enrolled address, and sort of whether we've looked at that in terms of Wellington, given our growing homeless population in those regards.
Well, that might be more of a question for someone other than me, or at least with respect to this project. But what I can say is that the numbers that we put together when it comes to households are essentially means. So mean size. So it doesn't look at overcrowding. What I can say from talking to people from Hutt City is that there has been a substantial, in their view, substantial undercount out of the census. The household housing numbers were actually rated as very poor out of the census. A few tweaks to try and fix that with some admin data, but fundamentally what it means is the best data source we possibly have to understand how people are living is rated poor. And that's a real shame, and it has really affected people's expectation of people's measures of unserved demand. So that, it might be an apocryphal story, but the stories of 20 people in Hutt City, for example, living in a household, they're never going to be counted in. So we're just not understanding the full extent of overcrowding. Those are the only discussions I've had on that point with Wellington councils, Wellington Regional Council. So I don't know what the case is for Wellington City.
Cool. And that fits nicely into my second question, which is just around, you've mentioned substantial undercounting as potential in the Hutt, but how will we be, I guess, writing that into our own assurances within the data, because we do have homes in Strathmore that have 20 people living in one house, or other places in Tawa and Linden. So I guess how do we make sure that we're not under predicting our need for housing when, to me, it looks like that problem is growing, or we have a lot of evidence to show that there are overcrowded places or people living in our town belt that will never be counted by a census? Is there any way that with the work that you've done in the Hutt can kind of be translated into what you're presenting to us today? Sorry, I'm not sure if you're speaking.
Well, my view is that's a separate thing, and it's a not trivial thing to have to try and understand. So I don't think our numbers do adjust for census undercount, which most household count numbers don't do. So we do make that step, but in terms of identifying particularly vulnerable people or latent demand for housing, that this doesn't assess that in any sense, and it's a material consideration.
Could I just jump in there and say that there is a project separate to this looking to improve the quality of data around people experiencing homelessness, and we are involved in that. The research and evaluation team is, as well as a number of other teams at council, but it isn't yet connected to these works, but it could be in the future if the quality of data gets good.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah. I could add one minor thing on that count, as we're trying to resolve exactly those sorts of problems in some micro simulation work we're doing for housing and urban development, but that's a wee way off before that will be complete.
Thank you. And I've got Councillor Condi and Rush. Is there any other councillors online that want to ask a question? Sorry, I can only see 1.5 of you. Okay, Councillor Condi, thank you.
Thank you. I'm just coming back to your point about the Stats New Zealand data, when you said that the top of their range is essentially less than one standard deviation away from the current mean. And I guess as a relative layperson, I found that kind of flabbergasting. Like, to me, it almost seems like irresponsibly conservative. And I guess it would be really helpful if you could give us some context about why Stats New Zealand, like there must be a reason why they're doing that. So can you give us some context about why Stats New Zealand numbers do appear to be so conservative?
One, they are risk averse and it's not in their interest to rock the boat. Two, they use absolute numbers based on history. Now, clearly, the reason we link our migration numbers to global population is global population got an extra couple of billion people in it, of which, maybe a billion of those were substantially better off and capable of migrating to a place like New Zealand over the last 20 years. But their numbers reflect an average over, say, the last 20 or 30 years in absolute terms, counts of numbers of people. So they don't have any trend in them. They do add high migration projections, but even those are built around deviations around an absolute number from the past without appreciation for the scale of the change, both the scale of the change of New Zealand and the scale of the change of size of economy and population and living standards elsewhere in the world. And it's never, I think the critical reason for that, I've had debates with Stats over this quite some time, including in the context of work we did for Reader over future population change a few years ago now. Stats ultimately presents a preference for conservatism and keeping things very simple, particularly given the political issues that migration raises. I don't think they would disagree with any of those things. I mean, beyond that, you might want to ask them.
Thank you. Any other questions?
No, thank you. That was very helpful.
Very succinct. Thank you. Can I just ask a question, which is, thank you, because you've made your assumptions clear and you've made lots of qualifying statements. So as decision makers, how do we use this? Because it actually just seems there's so many assumptions. And the other thing is, the Mayor will attest, we were told that we'd made enough land available to, build enough homes and many, many, many times. So how do we move forward knowing that we've got the right information to make the right decisions? Because you don't have a crystal ball, right? So.
Correct. Well, I think so. There's two things. I don't want to. Well, two things. One has to ask oneself, if thinking about this chart here that's still up there on with the uncertainty bounds, ask oneself whether or not the questions at hand have asymmetric or symmetric risk. You can't get it right. You're not going to get it right. But are the costs? Do the costs? If you overshoot, are the costs much larger than, or the net benefits, whatever, much larger than if you undershoot? And think through things in those terms. Okay. Okay. I fully appreciate that, and the other thing you can ask is whether or not there are other forms of there are flexible mechanisms that means that you can adapt. And frankly, one way in which this project of doing projections is helpful is that it is a adaptive mechanism whereby we can rethink these things over the next. So people go, it'd be terrible if the projections change, in 2 years' time. Well, if in 2 years' time there's a global depression and another. And a natural disaster of some kind, I'd hope you'd want to be adapting, adapting your view. So you want to be adaptive as best one can. I think the other thing that you can ask, and I probably should have emphasised this a bit more, is you can ask yourself how compelling the outlook is and the key assumptions, and just think about those. And the reason I say that is that it's been over the last 6 or 7 years, maybe more. I have constantly had to defend our projections for a range of clients against people who pilloried them for being too robust, and our numbers turned out to be too low in general, but we were just much stronger than Stats. And the reason we were stronger than Stats is if you run trends through in-migration, it tends to have this slope, and outward migration tends to have this slope, which means that growing in trend over time, you get more and more people trying to turn up. And that's exactly what happened. Now, I'm not stupid enough to think that because I was right in that context, I'll always be right into the future. But to me, that was a compelling narrative. And so, because it's based on a very simple presentation of long-term trends and facts. So I think if you ask those questions again, as you're asking about where the assumptions come from, and really saying, why would you pick that number over that number, then you should be able to convince yourself and then of whether or not the direction looks broadly right, and then acknowledge that you're going to be wrong and use the uncertainty bounds.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Rush.
Yeah, thanks, guys. Hey, I'm going to spend some time going into this in later time, but I'm just wondering about what the data tells us. Is there have you done any sensitivities around things such as house prices and what the effect that has on a Wellington central population or jobs availability? Is that sort of, are you guys able to run that sort of analysis?
We haven't done it in this context, so we did do it in the past. I think it would be maybe 5 years ago. I did a piece for Wellington City on impacts on future population growth expectations and on impacts of house prices, amongst other things, and a model of that. So while we can't put prices aren't directly in this set of modelling, what I can say is what's interesting is statistically it looks very much like the in impact of increase in house prices is not far off the out impact of house prices, which is to say when house prices go up, people stay in place more. It reduces the out migration. Now, you've got the endogeneity between lots of people turning up and then the prices go up, but also people being chilled in terms of their willingness to come if prices go up. And the two things seem to really cancel them out anyway in terms of the effect in the in and the out. What seems to be more important is the labour market element. In general, having said that that's 2015, 2016 analysis, so it didn't include anything like the absolute changes in house prices and land values that we've seen nationally in the last 2 or 3 years, so may not be applicable anymore.
Yeah. Well, I'm just sort of interested in the story around the hut, and I'm wondering, is there a demographic analysis that you can say that actually families went to the hut, young professionals came into Wellington, or older retired folks? Does the data enable us to make those sorts of assumptions?
It does enable you to interrogate them down in the detail. Yep, completely.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else with a first-time question? Right, we'll just finish off because we have gone over time with the Mayor. Final question, thank you.
Yeah, just one question there. Just in terms of those long-term trends that you said they're based on, so I just pulled up the numbers on migration. The highest 6 years of migration, I think, pretty much ever, were the last 6 in net terms. That's a national number rather than a local number. Is that the kind of thing that you're using? Because if you look back over the previous 20, it was much more like this. But the last 6 were all way up here. 38 was the lowest, and some of them was as high as just over 70 as net numbers.
Yeah.
So that's what the question I'm asking is: are you using that as the basis for going forward, that last 6 or 7 years, or are you using something that's a bit longer trend than that?
So the data we use is 30 odd years, fitting a model that predicts migration by country regions, taking account of unemployment and so forth, and the Australian conditions in Australia.
Yeah.
So it takes account of all the information. So it doesn't extrapolate just. I guess there's a model, although COVID's ruined my model. But if you look at that chart, you can see that it doesn't. Its jumping off point was not the 2020 numbers, and the high points in there where it sort of rolls up and then spikes. That gives you that last 6 or 7 years. So you see our projection is our sort of central view, right? If you were to pick one number, is lower than the average of the last 5 or 6 years. So I guess in short, no, our jumping off point's not the trend of the last 6 years, but it is informed by it. Our models are informed by it.
Yeah.
The trends I'm talking about is if you were to map inward migration from the since basically planes turned up, 1970s. There's a persistent upward trend in international immigration into New Zealand. It's very clear. And that's the trend I'm talking about, which people don't take into account, which I think reflects income growth and population growth globally. People want to live here. It's always the issue being the mark of success is people want to share in it too.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, John and Christopher, thank you, and Baz also for all your great work, incredibly helpful. And I'm sure we'll pour over your presentation in more detail.
Thank you. And also, I'll just make sure when I get back to my desk to send around the online tools, we can work through the online tools.
That would be amazing. Thank you very much.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you again. Thanks, colleagues online.
Thanks so much. It was really interesting. I appreciate it.
Yeah, outstanding.